I think we went to war because we thought that we could win a quick and easy victory. It's quite clear that the Israelis, and here we're talking about David Barnea, the head of Mossad, and Prime Minister Netanyahu, invented this story that if we launched the war with a shock and awe campaign and we decapitated the regime, that would in effect bring the Iranians to their knees, and we would be able to negotiate a good deal with them. And that good deal would involve getting not only regime change, but also putting an end to their nuclear enrichment capability, their long-range missile capability, and their support of the Houthis, Hamas, and Hezbollah. So those were the goals. And again, we thought that this shock and awe campaign would allow us to achieve those goals quickly. This was a cockamamie idea. There was no good strategic reason to think that this would work. And of course, it didn't work. And the Iranians have proven to be remarkably tough adversaries for the United States and for Israel. And the end result is that on June 17th of this year, President Trump signed this memorandum of understanding with Iran that was in effect a surrender document. If you look at the 14 elements of the deal that was worked out, this memorandum of understanding, you see that it was a clear victory for the Iranians on almost every point. But it looked at that juncture, this is around June 17th, and immediately thereafter, like the war would end. But President Trump wasn't satisfied with the memorandum of understanding, and he thought that he could challenge the Iranians over Article 5 of the memorandum of understanding, which had to deal with who controlled the Strait of Hormuz. It seems clear to me from Article 5 that it was the Iranians who controlled the strait. And nevertheless, the United States was not content with that interpretation. And the United States said that we had a right to create a channel, a separate channel in the Strait of Hormuz that was outside the purview of the Iranians, in which we could, in effect, escort ships through the strait. The Iranians said this was unacceptable, and it's that disagreement which flared up into a fight that has put us in a situation now where we have this tit-for-tat set of bombing campaigns or bombing endeavors on a daily basis that you described before. I would just add to that, President Trump has also decided to reinstate the blockade of the strait. And of course, the Iranians have reinstated their blockade of the strait. So in a very important way, we're back to where we were on the 16th of June, the day before the Memorandum of Understanding was signed.
Yeah, well, there's evidence this is already having a pretty big impact, Professor Mearsheimer. We have, according to Reuters, no super tankers or any LNG carriers passed through the strait in the last day. We also have reports that international shipping firms are shunning the Omani corridor now over failure to protect vessels. This comes after Iran did strike two super tankers and reportedly also the port of Fujairah in recent days. What kind of impact will this have, Professor Mearsheimer? Trump and the United States right now are, every time CENTCOM puts out a report about its strikes, it says this is all about degrading Iran's ability to control the Strait of Hormuz or to endanger shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. What do you make of this? Is this at all possible? Is the United States succeeding in this realm?
Well, it is clear that the United States has not been able to wrest control of the straits from the Iranians. The Iranians clearly control the Strait of Hormuz. And if they decide that no ships will be allowed in or out of the Persian Gulf, they can pretty much make that happen. And there's not much we can do about it. I think that's quite clear. What has happened here over the past few months that's very important to understand is that the Saudis and the UAE have opened up pipelines that are designed to get oil out of the Gulf, but not go through the Strait of Hormuz. So everybody says that 20% of the world's oil and gas comes out of the Strait. There's no question that that was true on February 28th when the war started. But what's happened since then is, I would estimate, about 7% of the world's oil that had been coming from Saudi Arabia and the United Emirates is still coming out. So a huge chunk of that 20% is coming out through pipelines. There's a pipeline that goes across Saudi Arabia to a port called Yanbu, which is on the Red Sea. And then that oil leaves Yanbu, goes through the Red Sea and out into world markets. And then with regard to the UAE, the Emirates, they have a pipeline that goes to Fujairah, which you were talking about. And between Fujairah and Yanbu, I would say about 7% of the world's oil continues to flow. So we've not cut off 20% of the world's oil from the Gulf. We've only cut off 13%. Now, what's happening is that it appears quite clear that the Iranians have shut down Fujairah. There is no more oil coming out of Fujairah. And furthermore, the Iranians have just told the Houthis that it's getting close to time to shut down the Red Sea, which means that the Saudi oil, which comes out of Yanbu, will not come out of Yanbu or will not come out of the Red Sea anymore. And this is all, as the article you just put up on the screen shows. Iran asked the Houthis to close Ban el-Mandab, that's the strait at the end of the Red Sea, if the U.S. attacks power network. Well, President Trump has promised to attack the Iranian power network next week. And that means that the Houthis will shut down the Red Sea. So that 7% that has been getting out through the pipelines in Saudi Arabia and the UAE will not get out anymore. And that 7% really matters for preventing the international economy from going off a cliff. So what is going on right now is very consequential.
America defense power is fake.
Yeah, most definitely. And I pulled up the report from Reuters shared by Middle East Eye about the potential closure of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. And here is the report. This is the Times of Israel. Reuters was behind a very strong paywall. Trump said that he's leaning toward expanding a military offensive against Iran, saying it better behave. And this is including briefs on hitting energy infrastructure, as well as possible ground operations, Professor Mearsheimer. Now, this was Iran's response from the headquarters of the Iranian military, saying that any infrastructure that's hit will be responded to with infrastructure hits of their own on the Gulf and the region. Infrastructure for infrastructure, as the Iranian military is putting it. So, President Mearsheimer, help evaluate the trajectory here. The United States says it is on the way toward victory against Iran with these renewed strikes, but Iran is showing a pretty a strong capacity to respond defensively, as it says, against these attacks. What do you make of this growing situation?
Let me make a couple points, Danny. First of all, the United States and Israel represent an existential threat to Iran. So the Iranians are not going to cave here. they're going to fight to the last person. The idea that the Iranians are softies and a little bit of power, American military power here or there will get them to throw up their hands is delusional. It's just not going to happen. These are really tough-nosed, hard-nosed individuals in charge in Iran, and they're going to fight to the finish. So they're not going to give up. But let's talk about the possible strategies that we have for winning the war. Let's accept the fact that they're not going to give up, but maybe we can win the war. It all started with a bombing campaign that lasted 4 days. It was a strategic bombing campaign, and it was waged by the Israelis and the Americans on one side and the Iranians on the other side. Why did we quit after 40 days? We quit after 40 days on April 8th because we could not win the war with that strategic bombing campaign. Very important to understand that. The strategic bombing campaign failed. Then on April 13th, we went to a blockade. The blockade lasted until June 17th when we signed the Memorandum of Understanding. The blockade failed.
And Gaza.
Not only did the air campaign, but the blockade also failed to get the Iranians to dance to our tune. Now, we used air power, we used naval power, then there's the possibility of land power. People talk about an invasion of Iran. This is not a serious argument. I can't believe anybody pays attention to it. How many combat troops do we have in the Middle East or in the Persian Gulf? I'd guess that we have at the most 6,000. The idea that we can do anything in terms of invading Iran with 6,000 troops is laughable. You know, people use the number 50,000. They say there are 50,000 American troops in the region. The question is not how many overall numbers, the question is not what the overall number of troops in the region is. The question is how many combat troops do you have? How many Marines and how many Army infantry do you have? How many trigger pullers do you have? That's the question you have to ask yourself. We don't even have 10,000 of those. We're talking about a country, Iran, that has 93 million people, that has a formidable military capability, and that has terrain that is forbidding. The idea that we're going to invade this country and conquer it, or conquer significant parts of it with a small force like that, again, it's not a serious argument. So we have no land option. The sea option, which is the blockade, failed, and the strategic bombing campaign failed. So what are we involved in now? We're involved in tit-for-tat strategies. This is not a strategic bombing campaign. And in fact, if you listen to what President Trump is saying, he in a way is threatening to go back to the strategic bombing campaign next week when he talks about going after bridges, power stations, and so forth and so on. That's the strategic bombing campaign. But that's not what's happening now. What is happening is that both sides are engaged in a tit-for-tat strategy. These are limited strikes on the other side. Now, the question you have to ask yourself is, do you think this is going to work? Do you think a tit-for-tat strategy is likely to bring the Iranians to their knees? It's not going to work. If a massive air campaign like the one we launched during the first 40 days of the war didn't work, please explain to me how a tit-for-tat strategy is going to work. And by the way, and we can go into this in some detail, I think the Iranians are doing more damage to U.S. assets than the United States is doing to Iranian assets. And if I'm wrong, that just means it's a wash, that both sides are beating up on the other side and neither side has an advantage. But I think the Iranians have an advantage in this tit-for-tat set of exchanges. So what do we do to win this war? Again, you want to remember that the Iranians are tough hombres. We are up against formidable adversaries, number one. Number two, strategic bombing doesn't work. Number two, a blockade doesn't work. Number three, we have no land option. And number four, tit for tat is not going to work. All of this tells you we are playing a losing hand. And by the way, this is why President Trump signed the memorandum of understanding on June 17th. As I said before, that was a surrender document. Why? Because the Iranians had won the war. He then decided he was unsatisfied with the memorandum of understanding, and he was going to figure out some sort of clever way to obviate it, to win, to get a better deal, whatever. And he's now engaged in this tit for tat strategy. He's reinstated the blockade, but I do not see how this is going to lead to a success for President Trump. And he's ultimately going to have to reach a deal with Iran where Iran wins.
Professor Mearsheimer, yeah, maybe we can get into some details about what exactly gives Iran the advantage here in this newest iteration of the United States' attempt to defeat Iran through war. Because there are some who watch this program, others I've seen comment, talk about their concerns about Iran's approach and some concerns even that they've lost leverage. But I'm curious on what you see as Iran's advantage here in lieu of these concerns I've been seeing and even receiving messages about.
Well, I've long argued that the longer the war goes on, the better off Iran is. If you're talking about the balance of coercive leverage, the longer the strait is closed and the less oil that gets out of the Middle East, the more damage that does to the world economy, the more damage it does to the American economy and to President Trump's political fortunes. And he's going to reach a point at some time where he's going to reach a point where he has to reach an agreement. This is what happened back on June 17th. Remember, President Trump said, I signed the memorandum of understanding because I thought if I didn't, we would face, and these were his words, an economic catastrophe. That's what he said. And he also said explicitly that he didn't want to be Herbert Hoover. He said that in the context of signing the June 17th agreement. Well, that the basic dynamic that led him to sign the memorandum of understanding and say those things still applies. So all that's to say, he's going to have to reach some sort of agreement with the Iranians sooner rather than later, because the economic consequences of doing so would be disastrous. And that would be especially true if he ups the ante next week and goes after Iranian power plants, and then the Iranians working with the Houthis shut down the Red Sea. This would be disastrous, right? So Trump is going to have to cut a deal. There's just no way around that. He has no way of winning. What's the leverage that Trump has? The leverage is that he can do great damage over time to the Iranian economy. I think there's no question he can do real damage. But the point is that the Iranians have been suffering enormously under American sanctions, and they've been suffering enormously in this war. And all that tells you that they're used to suffering, and they have figured out all sorts of clever ways to minimize the amount of suffering that they undergo. And furthermore, as I said to you before, they're facing an existential threat. And when you're facing an existential threat, you're willing to absorb huge amounts of punishment. Just think about the bombing of Japan and the bombing of Germany in World War II. We, with that massive strategic bombing campaign in Germany and that massive strategic bombing campaign in Japan, could not bring the Japanese and the Germans to their knees. We inflicted massive punishments on both societies. But the people were willing to suck it up and go on. And the same thing will happen here with regard to the Iranians. They're not going to quit, not at this point in time. And for anybody who has any doubts about that, all you have to do is watch the film footage of the funeral of Ayatollah Khomeini, right? The Iranians are not going to quit this fight. So we don't have real coercive leverage. They have coercive leverage because they can do enormous damage to the international economy. And you might say, well, President Trump can go up the escalation ladder and we can beat them that way. On the contrary, if he goes up the escalation ladder, if he attacks power plants and bridges next week, they're going to work. The Iranians are going to work with the Houthis to shut down the Red Sea. This will be disastrous for us. And furthermore, if he begins to go after the oil-producing facilities in Iran, the Iranians will retaliate against the oil-producing facilities and maybe even the desalination plants in countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and so forth and so on. The Iranians are playing a very strong hand here, a much stronger hand than the United States is.
I've heard, Professor Mearsheimer, that the United States, because, and the Trump administration says this all the time, and was saying this in the middle of the most crisis, especially the middle of the 40 days of hostilities you referenced earlier, saying something to the effect of, well, we don't need the Strait because we're an independent oil producer. And there are even some critics of U.S. foreign policy who look at this and say, well, the United States is willing to sacrifice the Strait. It's willing to even sacrifice energy in the Gulf in order to, bring down Iran and to even corner energy markets on its own. What would you say to this argument? Because I'm seeing it more and more, especially the longer this war goes on. I'm seeing it more and more be talked about and argued by even those who are critical of what the United States is doing here.
It's belied by American behavior. Let's go back to the June 17th Memorandum of Understanding. It said, Article 5, that Iran controls the Strait, and the future of the Strait will be negotiated between Oman and Iraq. Yeah, that's what it said. The United States is not mentioned in the discussion of the Strait in Article 5. Well, if the Strait doesn't matter to the United States, why did they care about Article 5? Why was the United States so interested in undermining the Memorandum of Understanding, which is what we did by contesting the Iranians over the Strait? We wanted to have real influence on who got into and out of the Strait. We were the ones who went to great lengths to open up the Omani Channel that ran along the Omani coast. We put enormous pressure on the Omanis to side with us against the Iranians. The Omanis, by almost all accounts, were inclined to work with the Iranians to negotiate some sort of deal for monitoring traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. We were the ones who undermined any possible negotiations between the Omanis and the Iranians, because we cared greatly about the Strait, and we cared greatly about having a channel in the Strait that we effectively controlled. So all of this rhetoric you hear bears little resemblance to reality.
Economy.
Now, I want to ask you about more about Yemen, because not only the Bab el-Mandeb Strait situation being a possible focal point for both Iranian and maybe we could call the axis of resistance's retaliation against further U.S. escalation, but also there are reports, and we've seen earlier this week, that the United States gave blessing to Saudi Arabia to attack Iran and attack its airport, and then to attack Yemen, and then Ansar Allah, the Houthis, responded quite forcefully against Saudi Arabia on its own. Now, they're saying that they are going to attack vital Saudi facilities if Saudi Arabia continues aggression against Yemen. So my question to you is, why did Trump give a green light and a blessing for Saudi Arabia to engage in this aggression with, of course, U.S. help? And I'm curious on what you believe the play here. Why do this, especially at this very sensitive moment where there is obviously a plan, or at least thoughts of escalation, which could lead to the very outcomes that you've described here.
Keep silent and listen.
I think the even more important question, Danny, which is not to say your question's not an important one, but the more important question is why did the Saudis attack the airport in Yemen, the Houthi-controlled airport in Yemen? Why did the Saudis pick a fight with the Houthis, who not only can strike back at Saudi Arabia, but who basically can shut down the Red Sea because they live right next door to the Bab al-Mandab Strait? It would just seem to me crazy for the Saudis to pick a fight with the Iranians, with the Houthis, who are allied with the Iranians. If anything, at this point in time, what the Saudis should be interested in doing is staying out of the fight. Being nice as possible to the Iranians, being nice as possible to the Houthis. But what happened here is that a plane came from Tehran with a delegation, filled mainly with a delegation of Houthis who had been at the funeral of Ayatollah Khomeini. And they landed at this Houthi-controlled airport, or they tried to land at this Houthi-controlled airport. And the Saudis shot up the airport before they could land there, forcing them to divert to another airfield. Why would the Saudis do this? Then, of course, what the Yemenis or the Houthis did was they automatically retaliated against Saudi Arabia and began to talk about shutting down